I'm Michelle, and I'm a part of Group 18 with two other members, Jake Panther and Adam Soughton.
Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Salton, and I will be introducing the current problems in American journalism that my group will be covering in our presentation. This presentation will cover the problems with the current economic model of American news and journalism and the effects of a profit-driven news industry. As well, we will provide a possible solution for these issues. Let's get started. The current economic model of American journalism is a model of the past. Before the age of the internet, the newspaper and local news business was a very profitable business to be in. Newspapers and television was the number one spot for ad placements and marketing, making it a very competitive business to be in and in turn leading to the delivery of high quality news to their consumers. That was, of course, before the internet came around. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a great shift in the way Americans consume their news. Americans are increasingly moving towards digital consumption of news, relying heavily on online news sources like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other big national news sources. This in turn has led to a decline of local news consumption and overall profitability of the previous economic news model. Businesses looking to advertise their products have now gone away from traditional newspaper ad placements and in turn to digital marketing. This has ultimately led to a sharp decline in local news effectiveness and has actually created local news deserts across the country. This decline has additionally led to a decline in overall quality of news consumption, especially at the local level. With the current economic model, local newspapers are forced to compete for clicks rather than traditional investigative and informational journalism, which is now leading to a lack of local investigative journalism, a lack of education and information for local news affairs, and a disappearance of previous public forum that these local newspapers and news sources created once in the past. Put simply, local news sources of the past can no longer compete with the current rising national digital news sources. And if they're able to survive, their quality of journalism has depleted significantly due to the economic squeeze for profit-driven news. I'm going to pass over to Jake now to talk about some specific examples of this.
My name is Jake Panther, and I'm going to start off the evidence portion of this presentation by discussing Ricky Bevington's really interesting TED Talk about modern news media, and relating this back to the overarching point this presentation is shedding light on, which is talking about profit over quality news and the effects it has on local news/journalism. Bevington describes her experience working as a local TV news producer at a media market station in New England in 2005. As she was working one day, her boss came up to her wanting her to make up a story about how heated car seats can be dangerous and even deadly. She goes on to talk about how the story made no sense, but her boss insisted that the news station needed to put out the story to get the attention of viewers to be able to sell more expensive advertising, in contrast to giving people news that could actually be beneficial to them. This is a large issue with news media that because they want clicks for profit and not really want to be able to provide information that can help people. Ricky goes on to talk about how the public had an unspoken implied contract with the media and how trust is a contract. And the public contract with the news has slowly been deteriorating over the past few decades. She brings up statistics stating that less than 25% of Americans actually trust the news, which is actually a very scary thought to think about. And regarding the attention economy, this describes the economics of news media and how in today's times many outlets are being paid just by viewers' attention, not necessarily relying on advertisements, revenue, and subscriptions. And this model promotes articles that have clickbait and aren't really factual, nor important information. She goes on to say, and I quote, "News outlets simply giving the public information so that you can understand the world better no longer keeps the news media in business." This is important looking back to Michael Schutz's list of how news can help democracy. First, with the information aspect. Since the incentives are in the wrong place for these news outlets, how can citizens make sufficient political or social choices if the information they're receiving is not fair and it's biased? I'll talk more about this on the next slide, but regarding the importance of newspapers, Bevington discusses how vital these newspapers are to communities and how they can help represent communities' characters and identities. She goes on to talk about how if we want the news media to supply us with the information that helps us, we have to free them from having them to hold our attention and break them free of the attention economy. And how, when we pay for our news, we're demanding that the news media supplies us with journalism rather than clickbait. Regarding the destruction of local news, there's a large unawareness in communities. And I found this really interesting article by The Atlantic that talks about how local news is dying, that the vast majority of Americans aren't even aware of this issue. According to a Pew Research study, 7 in 10 Americans believe that local news are doing well financially. And according to that same report, over 1,300 communities have completely lost local news coverage, and a large chunk of Americans aren't even aware of these issues. As we're living in an extremely advanced technological time, local newspapers have been displaced by Google, Facebook, and Craigslist, and these sites changed the economic business model forever. As people have moved to free content and get their news from the internet rather than newspapers, even though newspaper reporters used to be the backbone of every local journalism ecosystem. Fragmentation issue involves the issue that there are so many options in the media environment, which creates this competition and created news media having to add entertainment to hold their audience's attention. As Americans have shifted away from local news, turnout in state and local elections have fallen, and we're seeing fewer candidates run for local office. And lastly, there are several consequences when abolishing local news. For example, community members lack information they need to participate in the political process and hold government and powerful actors accountable.
Thank you, Jake. Now that we know the problems and examples that local news is facing throughout the nation, let's turn to a possible solution to combat these issues. As the issue created by profit-driven news industry are directly correlated with the shifting economic model of the news industry, our group found that increasing the ability for local news sources to operate free of economic burdens through a nonprofit style of journalism to be the most effective way to return the public good of American journalism to these local communities. Increasing the ability for local news sources to operate as a nonprofit through the expansion of federal funding for the CPB and the implementation of tax exemptions for these local news sources would make it economically possible for these local news sources to operate again. Further, according to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and a study by the Pew Research Center, 172 digital nonprofit outlets launched between 1987 and 2012, with at least 71% being formed between 2008 and 2012. Many of those groups joining together into what is now called the Institute for Nonprofit News, a community of publishers that share the best practices, collaborates on stories, pools resources, and receives cutting-edge training in professional, organizational, and business development. By focusing on important local stories, many of these nonprofits fill informational voids that exist in communities across the nation. This nonprofit model would allow for more local news sources to operate economically sustainably and focus less on turning profits. It would also give local news sources the ability to report on what they feel is important again, lead to more education of the public on important issues rather than attention-grabbing headlines for clicks, return local-based investigative journalism to these communities, and recreate a space for public forum in these communities. Now that we know a possible solution, let's look at the limitations for this possible solution.
Although we feel very passionately about our solution of creating more nonprofits for local news, there's some limitations that have to be said in order to be realistic. A lot of these limitations are logistical ones, such as raising legislative action for increasing nonprofits. These are hard to enact and they take time. Another limitation is the fact that we won't have as much money as for-profit news organization. This means that our nonprofit news organization will not be able to competitively pay the wages of for-profit, meaning that there might be a lack of workers or contributors. This would also call for a huge fundraising of the CBV, the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, that helps distribute funds from the American people to making nonprofit news. Finally, nonprofits in general are more at risk at lawsuits because of the lack in funding. And with our emphasis in investigating, this could be a serious issue that we have to consider. The other limitations are problems that we have talked about in class that either won't be helped or potentially have negative effects. And this is include adding to the already existing echo chamber. We have learned that oftentimes echo chambers happen not only on internet spaces, but from your local neighborhood. Therefore, having a local news might add more to this problem. Another limitation is that trust in the news is lower than it's ever been before, and this can cause some issues in having problems before it's made and after it's made, not having enough support. And finally, for our last limitations, we know that mainstream news medias help keep each other accountable. This is why with a higher increase in competition, there's often higher increase in accuracy of the news. Because of this might be a clear limitation of a local nonprofit news because there might not be as much competition for local news. This could lead to less accurate information and less accountability. In order to wrap up lecture today, we're going to go over 2 last points to summarize our presentation. 1. Why should we care? And 2. What are the next steps that we can do, even today, to get to the solution or at least better the problem? First, why should we care? Because the current economic model of news is prioritizing profit right now over quality. And as we talked about in our lecture, we can see that this is linked to a rapid decline in local news. And local news is democracy. Local news has been linked to spurring action, to informing citizens, and we see that a lack of local news is linked to a loss of engagement. With no engagement, our democracy cannot function. Local news is so important because it covers so many things that the mainstream media cannot do. Like we talked about in lecture, how it fails to do investigation, democratic education, and public forum. So now let's talk about ways that we can save local news. And it's easy. The first most important step is to get involved. Is to read local news, consume more, click on it, let them know that you want more. Even call your representatives, ask for more nonprofits. Call your friends. Tell them about the importance of local news that you've learned today in this lecture and in class in general. The more that we talk about local news being linked to our democracy, the more that we are going to be able to save it. And if you really liked our solution and believe in it like we do, then you can also donate to the CPB in order to help them fund more local news. Finally, this can be considered extra credit, but think about even contributing to local news yourself. Write a blog, make a website, even, let's say, make a YouTube channel. Anything that spreads awareness that local news is crucial for our country and that the news should not be revolved around profit or quantity, but quality, about community, about education, about what's happening here and what can you do in your own neighborhood. Thank you so much today for watching our lecture. We are Group 18 and we hope you have a wonderful day.